Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The world has been observing the 100th anniversary of World War I over the past year and a half. And one of the most momentous events to emerge out of that war was the Russian Revolution, which brought forth the first communist regime in history, dedicated to implementing the vision of Karl Marx. What happened when Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks implemented socialism for the first time? Well, there turned out to be some significant gaps between theory and practice, and this led to an important debate amongst Western economists about the potential for planning an economy. What lessons can we learn today from this first attempt to plan a national economy and the ensuing economic debate? Joining me on EconVersations to talk about this is my colleague from the Johnson Center, Dr. G.P. Manish. GP, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Nice to be with you again.
So, in February 1917, the Tsarist regime in Russia collapsed.
Right.
And this led to a new regime, but didn't completely change what was Russia's role in the World War I at that point, right?
Yes. So, the war has been going on for about 3 years, and Russia, of course, is fighting largely Germany. Mm-hmm. And the Tsarist regime collapses largely because of some of the problems which the war exacerbated. Some of the problems, the war created a lot of economic, social tension within Russia, and many, it brought to a head many forces that had been building up against the Tsar and the monarchy over many years. And what happened when the Tsarist regime fell, of course, was the creation of the provisional government, led by the party called the Socialist Revolutionaries, and essentially what happened was that they didn't back out of the war, which was one of the main demands of the people who had, or of the large masses of the Russian people who had helped topple the Tsar. And
then this led to certainly in retrospect, a very momentous decision by Germany. Vladimir Lenin had been a long-term agitator, revolutionary in Russia. He had been living in exile in Switzerland during the First World War, and Germany decided to give Lenin and some 30 other Russian dissidents safe passage back into Russia in hopes that they were going to foment further revolution. Right?
Yes, the abdication or the first revolution happened in February of 1917, and that's when Germany made the decision, and then the Bolshevik Revolution, of course, occurred in October of the same year. And the idea was, Lenin had been planning for years in exile, to bring the Tsarist regime down and to institute a socialist or communist regime. And the Germans thought, well, now's the best time to throw him into the mix because, all hell's breaking loose as it is. Who knows? He might just turn up trumps, and he did.
Yeah. And I think the bottom picture there is supposedly Lenin's return to Petrograd,
right,
off the train from Finland after he had managed to get back with the German aid.
Yes, and of course Lenin was one of those people who had this real belief in himself and could see many steps ahead, as sort of like a political entrepreneur. For example, when he stepped off the train in February, he was the only one who said that him and his followers are going to get into government. Nobody else would have ever thought that that's a possibility, but he had a real firm belief and resolve.
And Lenin himself was actually more of an intellectual than a practical politician necessarily. He was a theorist in his own right on
yes,
both Marxist theory and revolution.
Absolutely, and that was in a sense the case with almost all Russian politicians, because politics itself was banned in a sense under the Tsarist regime. Over the Russian monarchy was absolutist, autocratic, very, very repressive of any sort of political activity. So this was true of almost all Russian politicians. They all had to kind of be theoreticians, and since they could not really practice politics. But of course, Lenin did make contributions to the theory of Marxism and of socialism and communism, especially his theory of imperialism, which was extremely important for him to justify the steps that he took to bring about the Russian Revolution. But yes, at the same time, he was always plotting and trying to gain power, for his political party.
So it was a relatively rare confluence of somebody who had thought seriously about, trying to remake society
Yes.
as an intellectual, and then also given the opportunity,
right.
the practical opportunity to go ahead and do this.
Right, and Lenin at an early age was alienated from, the broad Russian society, largely because his elder brother, had become a revolutionary and was executed. And then after that, I think Lenin and his whole family were alienated. He himself felt alienated, largely because the injustice, the fallouts of a lot of political repression. But yes, you're right in the sense that he then, started delving deeper into Marxist ideas and started thinking as a theorist, in the realm of theory, but also at the same time had one foot, in trying to bring about change, and he was given that opportunity.
And then, I guess you probably wouldn't have necessarily expected it when Lenin got back to Russia, but in October of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution came about,
Yes.
Occurred, and Lenin and his relatively small group of hardliners actually managed to seize power in Russia.
Yes, and Bolshevik in Russian means majority. And that was because of the fact that when the Russian Marxist Party or the Social Democrats split into two, Lenin's faction happened to be, have a narrow majority. But of course, by the time of the revolution and this October of 1917, they were actually the minority, and a small minority at that. And many historians believe that actually what happened was a coup, that what the Bolsheviks managed was essentially a coup, that they took advantage of this extremely, moment of chaos, and just grabbed an opportunity to grab hold of the reins of power. But of course, one thing that Lenin, many historians also agree on, is that Lenin's aversion or his strong line on pulling Russia out of the war, in many ways, could have been the critical factor that ensured that the coup became a regime. Of course, there was lots of repression involved, as we will talk about.
Well, and so one of his first things that he did after forming this government was actually negotiate Russia out of the First World War.
Yes, and so he realized, and again, this is his ability to kind of sniff the wind and realize which way the wind is blowing. He realized that the biggest thing that the Russian people wanted was to get out of the war. And that when they did get into the war, they were ill-prepared. Lots of them were effectively thrown in with no equipment into a highly dangerous situation. Russia was anyway a really poor country. Its peasants had been laboring under a serfdom for generations. And so in a sense, he knew that this was the one thing that would win him and his party kind of a popular acclaim. And yeah, that was one thing he did do.
But he was also a dedicated Marxist and had the strong desire to actually implement a communist or socialist economy and regime on the vision first laid down by Karl Marx, right?
Yes, definitely. Lenin was definitely an avowed Marxist. There's no doubt about that. Like I said, he made contributions to the body of Marxism. He studied Marx's works, often, as most Russian Marxists did, in exile in Siberia, when he was exiled, when the Tsar was still around. And he did believe that communism as an economic, or socialism as an economic system, is viable. And in a sense, during the war years, he learned or tried to mimic what was going on in Germany. When Germany during the war had a literally socialist regime, under the constraints of the war. And so in a sense, him and his followers did draw inspiration from that, in the sense that they said, well, it worked there in the wartime, so why can't it work in Russia? But yes, that was one key part of his overall vision.
And yet, after seizing power and establishing rule in the country, when Lenin and his cohorts decided to try to implement socialism, it turned out there was something of a gulf between theory and practice. That although Marx had written, the Communist Manifesto dates back to 1848. So although this was like 50 years, the idea of Marxism or communism in a socialist economy had been around for some time.
Yes.
There wasn't a really well laid out plan that to take off the shelf about how to implement a socialist economy, right?
Yes, and the main thing is that socialism is essentially an economic program, although it's draped in the language of morality and ethics and revolution and all of that, all of those aspects. There are aspects of that to the idea, but ultimately it is an economic idea. And the idea is that a drastic change in the institutional regime is to eliminate private property and to ensure that there's public property in all the means of production. But of course, one of the facets of Marxist thought was that he never actually analyzed how this system would work. In fact, he outright proscribed it on many occasions. So while his Das Kapital, which was his magnum opus, was a critique of the capitalist system or the market system as he saw it, he never actually laid down a plan and said, well, this is how we will work, this is how it will work. And of course, what contributed to it was also his theory of history, which is to say that, well, the socialism is like this millennium, right, which is coming. It's the final stage of man's history, and we just need to sit back and just enjoy it when it's here, because it will solve all of mankind's problems, and all this sort of almost secular theological talk without any real concrete idea of what is actually going to be done when you perform such a radical change on the institutional structure.
Or the exact details of it, how would you go about planning an economy? And so,
how would it work?
And so Lenin actually started doing this, right?
Yes.
He came up with an initial plan of how to, I guess, take this theory and put it in place and say, okay, we're going to try to attempt to plan the economy.
Yes.
And this is what is, I guess, in retrospect, dubbed the period of war communism under the Soviet Union. And this was actually an attempt to try to take this idea of abolishing the private property and applying it in an economy, right?
Yes, there's debate whether Lenin did it under constraints of war, as many historians argued soon after World War II when looking back on Russian economic history. But there are many other historians who have provided evidence saying that, well, the idea was to institute socialism. The war was just an excuse for it.
Okay.
And it's not just that this was what Lenin wanted to do because there was war and there was no other option. It was a proactive decision and not a reactive decision. And yes, what the biggest steps they took was to nationalize many parts of the economy, large parts of the financial and industrial sectors of the Russian economy, but also institute a very draconian system of trying to forcefully get grain from peasants, force those peasants to effectively part with their grain at certain fixed prices. And there was a lot of money printing involved, and almost the currency or money itself effectively became worthless.
And so you've already hinted a little bit, but that the system didn't work very well. The economic performance in Russia was quite bad.
Yes, one of the things which happened was peasants tried or refused to part with their grain at these controlled prices, and there was a huge disconnect between the countryside and the urban parts of Russia, because effectively food wasn't coming into the cities, and people actually, there was a huge de-urbanization during this period when people actually left and went to the rural areas and tried to effectively farm for themselves. And so there was a great breakdown in the division of labor, as what economists would say, right? The extent of specialization, the extent to which we produce for other people, there was a great reduction in the extent of that as a result of the policies instituted immediately after the Bolsheviks came to power.
No, at about the same time that Lenin was going about the business of trying to implement socialism, economist Ludwig von Mises wrote a critique of socialism, where he looked at, well, I guess you could describe this a little bit for us. His critique that started in an essay, but then was expanded into this book, Socialism.
Yes, economists had dealt with the idea of socialism before, even before Mises. One of the common arguments that economists made, which is quite a forceful one, but a simple one, is what is the incentive for people to do anything in a socialist economy? How can you force people to do things against their will or without giving enough adequate incentives in exchange for what they do. But then the socialists responded to that saying, well, once socialism comes to be, we'll have a new economic, new socialist man that people will forget, will not be working for themselves and for so-called selfish goals, but will become altruistic and will want to do things for the community. Well, Mises then wanted to counter this response, and he said, well, one of the problems any socialist government will have is that it cannot make any meaningful allocation of resources, because the only way any system of division of labor works, where some people produce for others, is of course if you produce the right things. Right? That you have to be able to produce the things that people actually want for the system to work. And one of his criticism was that, well, that would be impossible for any socialist government, largely because they won't be able to tell when they're allocating resources whether or not they're doing the right thing. And without prices, that's impossible for anybody to do.
So you need the prices that exist in the market, because the prices are what's sort of telling producers, the owners of capital in the private market, what needs to be produced.
Right, and Mises said, well, you need money prices in order for producers to make sense and to make decisions which are meaningful and which will actually result in a coordination, of production with consumption. That was his essential argument. But of course, he said, look, for money prices to exist, you need exchange and you need money, and that cannot exist by definition in a socialist system, because the goal of all socialists is to eliminate private property, in especially what are called the means of production of producer goods, right? So railroads and steel and iron and all these factories should be owned by the state, and all these allocations should be made by the state without exchange, without money. Well, then Mises said you will lose the compass that producers in a market economy use to allocate resources.
Now, as the war economy, or this first phase in Russia was struggling, their economic performance was bad, Lenin changed course, didn't he? And he came out with something called the New Economic Policy, and it represented a relatively radical change in what Russia was trying to do.
Right, and you could say that the policy of war communism was proof of both criticisms that economists had made. First and foremost, the incentive problem was big, because effectively, due to inflation and the controlled prices, peasants were getting paid literally nothing in order to part with their goods at these controlled prices and getting paid in these literally inflated tokens or notes, and they didn't want to part with their grain. So there was the incentive issue, and that kind of threw the whole system out of whack. But there was also the problem that of the misallocation of resources large scale, and so Lenin had to backtrack because the whole system was collapsing, and he took a number of steps. Most importantly, allowed trade in agricultural commodities, so allowed there to be more private enterprise and markets for agricultural produce, and also loosened some of the controls on smaller industrial undertakings, etc. So there was a loosening or a scaling back of some of the policies followed during the war communist era.
Actually moving more towards, I guess, a market-based socialism.
More exchange, right, more property. Of course, even during the period of war communism, it was impossible for them to completely abolish property, and that's never been done, even in those years. But what this was legitimizing exchange markets, things which are basically the foundations of capitalism.
Which you could argue was some proof that maybe Mises was right, and that
I think
Lenin was stepping back from the extreme version of socialism to something more with markets.
Yes, it was proof that essentially the economists had been right all along, that socialism doesn't work as an economic system. But
in the West, some economists then sort of responded to Mises' critique or challenge and tried to lay out some alternative views of how a more what eventually was called market socialism might actually work to meet this challenge, right?
Yes, what Mises' contribution did was it opened up a new debate amongst economists. and economists started actually debating for the first time, well, how would this new society work? Well, how would this new institutional system actually work? And two of the economists here, Abba Lerner and Oscar Lange, came up with a system where they kind of effectively, on many fronts, ceded many parts of Mises' argument. They said, well, we do need money prices, but what we will do is we'll try to mimic a centralized system to generate money prices. So they said, well, we don't want a centralized socialism. What we'll have is like a decentralized socialism, where essentially just the way you have private firms and you have private industries, you will have socialist or central or government-owned enterprises, but they will all be decentralized in that the iron producer can make decisions, right? So the bureaucrat in charge of iron or an iron firm will be able to make decisions without getting approval from some sort of centralized economic agency, right? So they said what the centralized agency can do is announce a set of prices, and all of these decentralized firms, all of these bureaucrats will then make decisions based on those prices, and that system can mimic, in a sense, what the market does, but do it without private property in the means of production, and thereby get over what, according to them, were some problems with a market-based system, such as large-scale inequality and business cycles, etc.
Now, in the course of this debate, Mises and his student, F.A. Hayek, sort of came to a realization that they were not thinking about economics. At the start of this debate, Mises thought he was thinking about economics in the same sort of fashion as most of the rest of his colleagues in the economics profession. But during the course of this debate, Mises and Hayek seemed to come to some realization that they've thought about economics differently, and that's of importance for us today, even here at the Johnson Center, because it's led to what's now today called Austrian economics, is sort of like a somewhat different way of approaching some fundamental economic issues.
Yes, and in many ways it was the debate between the market socialists and Mises and Hayek that led to this sort of intellectual clarification, so to speak, that Mises and Hayek realized, hey, we're not really talking and using the concepts the same way. There's a gulf here. And to some extent that was driven by developments occurring within economics as a field broadly in the 20s and 30s when this debate was taking place. But you're absolutely right. The main thing that Mises and Hayek realized is that while the market socialists had kind of, one of the problems with the solution provided by Lange and Lerner is that in many ways they had assumed away many of the resource allocation problems that actually occur in market economies, especially when there is no equilibrium, but when there's disequilibrium. And so Mises and Hayek realized that they're kind of moving along a different intellectual path as compared to many of their colleagues.
Well, Mises' student Hayek was part of this debate amongst economists, but he also wrote the popular novel, or a popular book called The Road to Serfdom near the end of World War II. And one of the things he warned is that not only might a socialist economy face the same kind of incentive problems of trying to operate itself, but there is also a real danger that once you have so much power invested in the state to plan the economy, that it might lead to the wrong kinds of people coming out on top, right?
Yes, absolutely. So, and in many ways, you could say that he was proven right by the rise of Stalin amongst the Bolsheviks themselves. In fact, there was, after the death of Lenin, there was a lot of power struggles within the Bolshevik party, and ultimately Stalin won those power struggles, largely because he was the most ruthless, and he could, go to lengths that other people didn't, want to go towards those lengths. And you could say, in a sense, that's like a fight over the ring, like the Lord of the Rings, right? And that brings out the worst in people. So Hayek's broader point was, when you have this, when you centralize power so much, and power begins to mean so much in a society, that it sort of creates a dynamic where you need to be more and more ruthless and take more and more actions that would otherwise be considered immoral in order to kind of claim the ring. And so therefore that brings out the worst in people as compared to, say, on the marketplace, where the goal is to serve others through producing products that others would like, and then you're forced to be nice to people. You can't treat them badly, right? And you could say in many ways that he was proven right by some of the developments that occurred, in the 20s and 30s in the Soviet Union.
I think one of the things that strikes me really sort of in looking back at this episode in history is, in circa 1920, when we were trying to plan the economy, or the economic debate about planning a socialist economy was occurring. I mean, just what we didn't have that might have been useful for operating or planning an economy. Like back in the 1920, we didn't have computers, obviously.
Right.
They came along later. We didn't have copy machines,
Right.
which, if you're going to hand out all these orders or
Right.
distribute orders, would probably be helpful. On the bottom right-hand side, we have like input-output tables that were developed later on by economists. And even like in terms of mathematics, the simplex method of solving linear systems of linear equations wasn't developed until during World War II. So even if you had a system of equations that might describe the economy, you wouldn't have been able to solve them in 1920. So it really strikes me like many of the concepts of the economics of information weren't developed until the 1960s or 70s. So we didn't really have many of the tools we would have needed to even understand the problems, and yet in some sense all of that seemed to be irrelevant. Like we're ready to go ahead and plan the economy, and we don't even know what's going to be involved in this whole
Yes,
stuff.
and you could think, you could think that indicates a sort of almost a messianic character of the whole socialist movement in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, almost in that the millennium is here, heaven is here on earth. And that's socialism. And that, of course, was contributed to a large extent by Marxist theory of history. And so there was, a lot, you're absolutely right, a kind of lack of even trying to think about what would be the consequences of one's actions, or of instituting a certain changes in, and whole-scale, widespread changes in society.
And I think a lot of this was summed up nicely by a phrase that Friedrich Hayek came up with for the title of his last book that he wrote during his longest career, called The Fatal Conceit.
Yes.
And so tell us a little bit about what this means.
Well, it's just what Hayek means by that is the conceit, in the sense that you can plan, like a whole economy. And you can plan something so complex and so difficult, and you don't give much thought to it, therefore signifying conceit. And it's fatal because, well, what happens when you try to do that is a lot of bad stuff.
And it's certainly an attitude that seems to persist even today, in this, the sense that, oh, well, we're ready to restructure the healthcare system in America, and maybe we don't know all of the details, but we don't need to know all the details, right? If you have the intent, if you have the right desire, it's good enough.
Yes, it is almost the tyranny of good intentions, and that is a problem. You have this vision that you think you can get to, and you don't care about, well, how is that system actually going to work? And yes, like Hayek said, there is a lot of conceit involved, and that has bad consequences.
Well, thanks very much for coming on and talk about this today. We've enjoyed the conversation. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.